Hello and welcome to part 2 of my 1/18 scale RC 4-wheel drive Gelande 2 eBay bargain or big mistake. At the end of the last video I'd taken out the transmission and discovered that the teeth on the brass pinion had been stripped off. I couldn't find a suitable replacement, so I ordered a transmission set which included a pre-installed motor complete with the pinion. While I was waiting for that to be delivered, I thought it would be a good idea to see if I could find out what caused the pinion gear to be damaged. I started by taking apart the transmission and checking everything over. The metal gears were in good order and the metal bearings were okay too. I cleaned it all up, re-greased the gears and re-oiled the bearings and put it back together. Everything turned as it should and it was very smooth, so at least it could be used for spares if needed. Now I've checked the transmission and it doesn't seem to be the problem. The next thing to look at is the axles. This is the rear axle, and that seems to run quite smoothly backwards and forwards. However, the front axle, you can turn it so far and now there's a sticking point there, and then you can get over that and it will turn again, and then again it sticks. Turn, stick. It's difficult to show on camera, but I'm touching it as lightly as I can with my finger, and there, now I can move it. I press it a bit harder, but again very lightly, and that is not turning. The drive shaft is free down there, so that's not binding on anything, and that is very sticky. So the axles need taking apart and investigating as well. I'll start with the front axle because that's the one with the problem. I've removed the steering links and I've taken the axle out of the chassis. Now I'll take off the knuckles and remove the diff cover. The diff cover's off and I can see there's hardly any grease on the gears. Next I'll remove the housing that holds the small diff gear, which also needs some more grease. This is held in by a tiny C-clip, which I won't be taking out because I haven't got the appropriate tools. But this isn't a problem because I can still put some grease on the gear with it still in the housing. Now the axle's completely disassembled, I can clean everything. Then I'll re-grease and lubricate the parts, and when that's done I'll put it all back together, checking for any problems along the way. One thing to mention are these brass bushings in the axle. These were a bit of a surprise and a disappointment because all the other bearings in this RC are metal and ball raced. Unfortunately I haven't got any metal bearings to replace the bushings, so I'll reuse them when I put everything back together. I put some marine grease on the small diff gear and fix the housing back on the axle using a tiny amount of thread lock on each screw. Then I put a few drops of oil on the outer bearing. The large diff gear was undamaged and I covered that with grease and put some oil on the larger bearings before putting it all back in the axle. Then I replaced the diff cover, also adding a dab of thread lock to each of the screws. Next I put the bushings back on the wheel shafts and then smeared some grease along them before putting them back into the axle. The threaded wheel shafts are also held in the knuckles with a C-clip, so I cleaned them out and added some oil to the front and back of the bearings before I put those back on. There's two screws which hold the knuckles to the axle, and when I put these in, the shafts wouldn't turn because I screwed them down too far and they were on top of the drive cups, stopping everything from rotating. I wound them out half a turn and this was enough to free up the cups. So because the axle was having trouble rotating when I tried to move it with my fingers, I think this is the cause of the damage to the pinion gear. When power was applied to the motor, the axle, which was stuck, was stopping the transmission from rotating, and the brass pinion, which was turning on the motor spindle, ground its teeth away on the stationary hardened steel spur gear. Now the hubs were installed correctly, I could put the axle back into the chassis. Now the front axle's back in the chassis, I can turn the wheels. There's no binding and it feels very smooth. Because the rear axle turned freely when I tested it, all I did was remove the diff cover to check the grease. There was a bit more on the gears compared to the front axle, but I put some more in just to be on the safe side. While I was doing this work, the new transmission was delivered. And here it is out of the packet, and because the chassis is now running correctly, I can put it in. Here it is in the chassis with its prop shafts connected, and now it's time to test it. First I'll run it upside down so there's no force on the drivetrain. That seems okay, so now I run it to and fro along the table. Now I'm going to use my hand as an obstacle for it to crawl over, putting a bit more strain on the drivetrain. Well, I'm very pleased with that test, and now I have a fully functional running chassis. This has cost me the total of £145.64 to buy and restore, which includes shipping for the RC and the new parts. So as far as the question, eBay bargain or big mistake is concerned, I think it's definitely an eBay bargain, considering my total layout has been less than half the price of a new one. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for part 3, where you'll see me making some changes to the body.